Okay, we're on live again. You guys in the room have behaved really well for the live streamers. You've been so compliant and helpful, so thank you. Using microphones, having discussions recorded around the world. Very kind of you. I want to come back just for a few moments about this pathway discussion. So I don't think I've quite captured it for you yet. And one of the ways might be to tell you more about this rabble of men. Actually goes back a couple of years. Some of them, 2 or 3 of them now leading teams of their own, which is a great joy to see that progress. But let me just put it in context. My understanding is your main establishing and equipping pathways are the adult Sunday school, right? Some of you have who has small groups as well as the adult Sunday school? Okay, you're the hipster churches, right? Like me, my kids tell me I'm so hipster. I'm so hipster I don't even know what it means. So you've got at least small groups and classes, which is an interesting experiment, and you would know more about it than I would, because we've never had the tradition of the adult Sunday school. So on Sunday morning, our members come to church, the children go to their Sunday school, part of the time they're in the church service, and then we have often 30 minutes to an hour after church, hanging around, having coffee, and enjoying each other's friendship and ministering to one another. But you have this different pattern on Sunday morning of Sunday. Who does not have a Sunday school hour? One. Oh, okay. All right. The issue behind the structure is how effective. This question here: how effective are your classes? Wrong way. I went the wrong way. How effective are your classes and small groups in moving people to the right? There's nothing sacred about any of our traditional structures. There's no absolute about having small groups. There's no absolute about having adult Sunday school. There is absolute about gathering people around the Word and praising and singing and learning the Word. But how you do it is a question of wisdom, a question of evaluation, a question of what are the goals? Are people moving to maturity? Are they, you can see the whole day today has really been about a heart change. This vision of disciples making disciples, learners helping others learn, is only going to happen if there's a heart change deep in the soul of our people. So it's not a matter of just rolling out the same programs year after year, but are they effective as classes, small groups? Paul just shared a minute ago, he's left the room I think, trying Sunday night activity as an experiment to get people learning better and thinking how they can apply the sermon. That's the kind of creativity you need, because the aim is maturity. The aim is moving people to the right. The aim is keeping people Christian till their last breath. And along the way, helping others learn. So whatever it takes at that point, whatever changes you... Now, the strengths of the class model of having learners in the classroom is you can do really good content. You can pass on information, you can teach doctrine, you can teach Christology, you can teach Romans, you can teach ministries, you can teach counselling, you can do anything in the class. The problem is, the issue that Todd raised before, you can't do Sudoku. You can't see one, do one, teach one. So it becomes a very intellectual sort of information and can become sort of indigestion problems where members over 20, 30 years have been to classes year after year. If they were living in Africa or Asia or South America, they'd be church planters. They know so much more than the average pastor because they've been going to so many classes over the years, but not really maximising passing it on. The problem with small groups, we have more of a tradition in the last 50 years or so of small groups in homes and at church and things like that, usually in people's homes. is that the level of teaching can be sloppy and low level, that the leaders are not well trained. So you have good community and sharing, and you learn to share your life, and you pray for each other, and you know each other better. But if the leaders are not strong, both in teaching and in pastoral ministry, discipling ministry, the groups can lose their way. They can become heretical, they can just be going nowhere, they can be focused on the social aspects. And there's churches all across the world now that have lost their way in terms of small groups. They're no longer moving people forward, even though people are enjoying their small groups. So at either end you can have problems. So the issue here is to work out the pathways that are going to do both really well, of teaching the truths of Christ, getting people into the Bible, learning their Bibles really well, helping them to be self-feeding, so they're learning how to feed themselves on the Bible, not just relying on the teacher. But then the big one we're talking about today is helping learners become teachers of others. And the classroom doesn't really allow that. The small group can do better at that, but the small group can be weaker in doctrine. Got the kind of tension? Does that capture anything of it? I don't know. That's my simple analysis of it. So what we've tried, and this is just one experiment, I'm not saying it's certainly not perfect, and these guys are certainly not perfect and would be embarrassed if they were even, well, they do know I talk about them, and I tell them that. Anything I write about them, I show them first, which keeps me honest. But they're great guys, and they're good friends from our family church. And one way or another, I've been working with them for 2 or 3 years. This particular group is disbanded, and we've tried other teams now, and some of them are running teams and serving in other ways. The idea was to help them to become men. They came into this particular team, and the teams we're running as quite mature Christian men. Most of them, all except one, had been Christians for some years and been in a good church, a really good Bible expository ministry for some years. Some of them I've known even from their college days. I can say it's a really good expository ministry because I don't do it, okay? Someone else preaches. They were refreshed by coming into a team that had an outward-looking focus. And they said that from day one. So we turned up on the first night, and I said, this is going to be different. Don't know what we call it. Cole's team didn't sound real good. I didn't call them disciple makers or anything like that. I said, we're not training you to be leaders. We want to train you to grow. We want you to equip you to minister to your family. And we'll see where it goes in terms of your word ministries to others. And that's exactly what happened. So I said, what would be the difference between running a team to a group? So we had a whole conversation about the difference between teams and groups. And I said, well, let's try some team things. And I threw out some ideas. We could go down to the local train station and invite people to our Easter services. We could go to the local, there's a club where we could book a room and have our own privacy and so on, and we could invite some non-Christians there. So we did, they agreed on those two things. They thought it was pretty crazy, but it got them thinking, it got them praying, because we're out now on the streets and we're inviting neighbours and work colleagues up to our club location on a Wednesday night. And we went to the club because it was a sort of a neutral territory. And that got them praying. And we ended up with 35 men on their prayer list. Some other men from church who seemed to be on the fringe and not really sure of their salvation. So we got them talking with them and praying for them and inviting them to come to these extra nights that we put on. And then quite a few were work colleagues and neighbours. So 35 men we're praying for. Only a few times a year we moved the Wednesday night team meeting up to this room in the club that we had and invited the neighbours. So we weren't doing that every week. We did it probably 8 times in the year, something like that. And lo and behold, some of our neighbours and friends came along. We didn't see anyone converted. I think there has been someone converted now, but not immediately. But it really got us praying. It got them thinking about how can they be making disciples of others. We went through the Course of Your Life material that Tony had just written. We went away for 24 hours and talked about that, which gave us an intense time together, a challenging time together. And we started emailing each other through the week. So we had prayer requests for other men through the week. We practiced ministry of the pew. So I said, we always talk to each other, go and talk to the older women next Sunday. And the older women liked that. They didn't know what was happening. But these middle-aged men started having conversations with the older women at church because we hung around with each other too much. And they certainly learnt, as I said before, how to talk to new men at church and fringe men at church. And some of them now go fishing with the fringe men, and they're trying to read the Bible with the fringe men. Some good stories there as I look at the bunch there of some personal one-to-one ministries starting up. But that's probably 3 years ago that was taken. We met for 2 years, and now there's been a year or so when they're in other teams and leading other teams. I don't know whether I'm just slow or the Word of God's slower, the vine grows slower where we are, but it just seems to take that kind of time to get a bunch of very busy men, professional businessmen and so on, raising their family, all the sports things on Sunday, just to carve out enough time to have really good sessions in the Word on a Wednesday night together, and then give them time to be meeting up with some other men socially and in the Word with other men. It's just slow. The Wednesday nights, what did it look like? It was about 40 to 45 minutes in the Word, often following the sermon series from the preaching or just books that we would choose to study. We'd work through books of the Bible mainly. And then 15, 20 minutes praying and talking about the progress with the men that we're praying for, and particularly praying for their children and their wives and their ministry at home. And then on some nights we do a bit of training, like ministry of the pew or how to answer questions, or not every night, but some nights. And then when there was some of these club nights coming up, we planned how we're going to... We got really good when the non-Christian men would come and join us. We got really good at playing tag team. And if Joe brought somebody, I'd make sure I'd go and meet Joe's guy and he'd meet my guy. And they were really good nights. It was a sense of teamwork and a sense of backing each other and supporting each other, and a bond, bands of brothers. We even talked about bands of brothers. I know it's corny, but we felt like that. Philippians was the first book we studied, because Philippians is about partnership in the gospel. And I wanted them to capture that from Philippians, of being partners in the gospel. That's what church should be like. So I don't think that's anything from what church should be like. I want to replicate that through every church in the land if I can. That kind of spirit. Now, it can be men and women together and women separately, but why wouldn't we be partners, bands of brothers, bands of sisters in the gospel together? And like I said before, I was doing more evangelism running these teams than when I'm on my own not doing it. And they felt the same. I'm sure those who are not in a team like this now are doing less evangelism, because it really kept us going. Evangelise in packs, okay? So that's an example of us in our context. It may not work anywhere near the same in your context, but in our context, of getting a pathway right, in this case with some men. And then the story on that is interesting. So after doing this, and our minister, Phil Colgan, was very much involved in doing some of this with me, actually running the team with me. After a couple of years, Phil, our senior minister, said to all the leaders and to the whole church, why don't we try a bit of this everywhere? But because we've been doing it under the nose of our members, they'd seen the difference between a home group and a gospel team. It wasn't that hard to say, let's all do some of this gospel team stuff. In fact, why don't we call all of our groups gospel teams? And the members said, they're a good, mature bunch. They love the Bible and they've got a great heart. And they said, that's fine. We don't quite know how it works. Team sounds a bit funny if someone's sick and, if you're inviting someone to a team, but it's sort of catching on. It's not perfected yet. Sometimes we still talk about groups and not teams. It doesn't really matter, but there's a palpable culture change happening, even in the life of a healthy church, which has, in our case, small groups. And just slowly more and more of the one-to-one Bible reading happening, the inviting happening, certainly the ministry of the pew happening. I wish there was a lot more fruit, but you can see the culture change taking place. But that's now I'm talking about over 3 or 4 years. And that's in a strong church to get this shift in how our home groups run. Okay? So that's my question there. How effective are your classes and small groups in moving people to the right? And just we want to finish up there on phase 4 and just to say a few things about phase 5. But any comments or questions about your structures? What haven't I understood about your structures that makes it hard for you to think how to do this in terms of getting the structures and the trellises effective? Some of you, I can tell what you're thinking, he's got no idea what happens in my church. Yeah.
I noticed the group that you had a picture of there.
Yep.
Seemed to be men, all working age men.
Yep. Yep.
Now, how would you go about if you had 1 or 2 college students or 1 or 2 younger
Yep.
men, maybe not boys, but definitely a different age stratum?
Yep.
How would you integrate them in, or would you feel that problematic and tell them to start another group for them?
I think it depends on the state of the congregation, Gil. So if you have a smaller group and you need to mix the ages, I could certainly see that happening. So you would immediately, in fact, a lot of people would argue this is the way it should happen. You'd have the older men mentoring the younger men within that group. Still doing the same material, the same encouragements, the same prayers and so on, but it would apply to those 2 or 3 different age groups. And you'd have an immediate opportunity for the older men, effectively the elders inverted commas, to take the younger men under their wing and talk about Christ, the Bible, read the Bible with them, talk about the decisions they're about to make in terms of marriage and work and things like that. So I can certainly picture that happening. How we do it, just in our particular church, we have a congregation on Sunday night. Actually, it does work like this. On Sunday night, where the young adult men and women go, and a lot of those guys I had on the screen there, they go to that in order to take their children and minister to the younger adults at Sunday night. So it just depends on your local context, how you do the generational thing there. Yep.
It's interesting, Cole, earlier you were joking about as you age getting more interested in senior homes.
Yep.
One thing I've noticed in ministry and different parts of the world over the years is there's very little ministry to seniors' homes.
Yep.
Very few churches send young people there to just go and visit people because those people are isolated, their family's not around, just to share them love, share the gospel. I think there's a huge gap in seniors ministry, especially too as the aging population is growing because of the longevity of life and so on.
Yes, some of our churches have ministers and ordained ministers on their team just to do that. Some of our bigger churches. It is an ageing population, as Sean said, and some of our members in our church, our lay members, have that as their ministry, and they have a wonderful ministry. I think it's women I'm thinking of, certainly Jackie's combination of men and women who have taken it upon themselves or been asked at some point to make that a regular part of their week, to go and read the Bible, to conduct services where that's a helpful thing, and to pray with the elderly and seniors and so on. Yep. Great opportunity for disciple making. All right. Anything else you want to ask about your structures and how to move them in this direction of learners, helping new learners? Good. Let's just quickly then look at the phase 5 in all of this, which is actually long in practice, but short to cover today. As we were writing Regrowth, we thought, what are we going to say at the end? What is we can't do everything in one book. What should be the focus? And I'm not sure I've persuaded Tony of this yet, but this is where I'm at, is these 7 things in terms of keeping the momentum going and growing toward this ministry culture. You've got to have an effective ministry leadership team. And I've used that generic language so you can include staff, You can include elders, you can include future elders, staff elders, non-staff elders. We're speaking into churches with a whole range of church polities, governance. But that is crucial, isn't it? To have the right people who can learn this culture and model this culture. Otherwise, you're shooting yourself in the foot with leaders who don't believe in it, who have a more traditional view of a consumer church, and that just won't change things. This can be difficult. It can take time to both teach the existing elders and leaders and to bring on new people, but it's a crucial part of it. I think the regrowth team won't necessarily morph into the ministry leadership team, but there'll be some of that happening. Some on the regrowth team, which is a short-term thing, will morph into the longer-term ministry leadership team. And there's some tricky issues there, aren't there, in terms of vested interests and people who've served hard and long, or people who have served hard and long but really haven't reflected this kind of ministry. But you need the right people on the team, however long that takes and however sensitive it might be. You'll have to work that out in your context. Then one of the things we haven't talked about, number 2, is committing to some strategic objectives, which sounds a bit funny in the light of everything else I've said today, but one of the signals that you really are serious about the Great Commission in your community and beyond is that you set some goals, that we want to reach this particular people group. It may be a people group like the seniors in our area. We really have that on our heart. And we're going to equip and train and employ some people to do that ministry. Or in our context, back in Sydney, it could be an ethnic group, the Korean community, the different parts of the Chinese community, the Muslim community, and certainly churches all around us are committing to strategic objectives to reach people groups. There's whole ministries too, or one particular ministry I'm thinking of, to reach people with a Roman Catholic heritage, and equipping people in our congregation and raising up leadership to have a particular heart and skills in bringing the gospel to Roman Catholic folk who share some of our theology but are confused about how salvation happens and have no assurance of salvation. But some churches do it numerically. They say we want to plant 2 or 3 churches over the next 10 years, a new church every 5 years, and they plan ahead and they have the suburbs worked out where they want to plant. That's another way of doing it. Another way is in terms of just the raw numbers. Let's try and double our fellowship in the next 7 years or whatever it is. You just have to work out your preferences on that. I think don't be outrageous. If you set ridiculous goals in terms of what's happened in recent times, in terms of the state of our community, you'll just make people cynical. But if you have no goals, you're saying we don't really expect things to happen. Because when you set those goals, then you've got to start thinking about staffing and leadership and budgets and buildings. And the members just won't believe that you believe in change if you don't start thinking ahead as to what it's going to look like for the leadership and facilities of your church. Let's reach 10% of our community for Christ. That would mean we'd need a church of 2,000 people. Our buildings take 500. Unless there's a discussion around that, either building the bigger building or planting several congregations in school buildings or whatever it is, people just won't believe you. They won't think that you actually think or pray that God's going to do anything. The way I do it, it's not telling God what to do. It's not saying he's got to grow at this rate, but it's saying what would we have to do to get to this point, this milestone in reaching our community in Christ, particularly in terms of leadership and facilities. Where are we going to meet? Who's going to lead? Who's going to teach? And then the model of ministry, have I got that separately? No, that's on some other stuff. The model of ministry, we're going to grow one bigger congregation or plant several congregations, those kinds of choices. And we can't say a lot about that in regrowth, but it's actually an important part of culture change to be seriously stretching and preparing for growth. Does that make sense? Okay. The third one, what are the critical factors that are going to have to change? What will stop us getting there in terms of this culture and in terms of growth? And that can be things like we just don't have the leadership in place. We've got to raise up leadership, both non-staff leadership and leadership that's paid for in pastoral ministry. Or it can be the facilities, those kinds of things. What are the critical factors we're going to have to address? And then start aligning everything around the vision. And this is one of the really painful bits, because there's a lot of vested interest in church with ministries that have grown up for the past 50, 60 years longer, with lovely people running them. But they are not actually engaging, evangelising, establishing or equipping anybody. It's just happening. And you can either help the leadership reform that ministry so it's aligned, or you can that ministry, you can stop that ministry, and that takes a lot of sensitivity. No matter how sensitively you do it, there can be pain, misunderstanding. But if you don't do that, if everything just goes on higgledy-piggledy, aligned in all kinds of different ways, you won't actually change the culture of the church. Does that make sense? So stopping some ministry, learning to stop ministries graciously, pastorally, caring for people, explaining why, taking the time is an important part of culture change. Then what are the key initiative plans, some milestones, things that we have to get up and running. And then one of the big things for me on this is leading effective team meetings, which Sean alluded to in a question earlier on. How do we run the team meetings so that people are at the focus, theology, Bible's at the focus, and not endless discussions about the colour of the pews. Leading effective team at every level of congregational life. Learning to do that is critical. Now, talking to some of the guys down here, Brandon and Colton before, they reminded me on this one of the sort of slightly a side point, but it fits in here. You know how often as pastors, those of us who are preaching, we prepare solo, we prepare privately, sitting in our study. Think about this, and I've seen this happen in churches. Philip Jensen used to do this really well. Spend the whole week in your leaders' meetings and the various team meetings that you run talking about your sermon. So you might do some preparation on Monday afternoon or Monday morning. But the whole week, wherever you go, even in personal visits with people, so I'm preparing Hebrews 10 for Sunday, and I'm trying to work out, and it's genuine, you're not faking it. I'm trying to work out verse 19, exactly what it means to draw near to God. It sounds a bit mystical. What do you think about it? And so you're having this conversation about the upcoming sermon in your leaders' meetings, your team meetings, your training Bible study leaders' meetings, even in personal conversations. So you're preparing in fellowship. What does that do for you? We agreed down here, these guys are on board with this, so I like them. They said it gets the congregation members anticipating the sermon, because they're really curious how it's all going to come out. It gets them thinking about how to read the Bible, because you're having good conversations about how to exegete the text. And it helps you, the preacher, to two things these guys said. One was just to understand the text, but also to anticipate the questions that are going to be in the congregation minds. I think Brandon was saying that about some of the college students. He does that with college students. And so by the time he gets up to preach, he's already alerted to where he needs to be prepared for the questions that are going to come. So I just throw that in there. I'd forgotten to do that before. It's amazing what you can fit into a list here. Leading effective team meetings. Just prepare your sermon with people through the week. I think that's great fun. Not that you won't do private preparation, you know what I mean. And then the last one seems a funny one, but it's a hard one. Identify gaps in leadership and management capabilities. Just be honest. You're a liberal arts graduate, you love reading Tolkien and history, you've got no idea how to manage anything, okay? You did really well in philosophy, church history, doctrine, but running a meeting, is just beyond you. As I talk to you now, you cannot conceive of what I mean by running a good meeting. No one's ever shown you how to run a good meeting. You've never learned project management. You've never learned how to cast a vision and communicate a vision in a way. You've never learned to raise funds. Well, get some help. Okay? Get some help from within the congregation. They become part of your team, contributing their skills. Get some help by some ongoing training. I get coached by people. I've got a lovely American friend, Steve Lindemann, who coaches me in coaching and mentoring and training. Find those people around you, particularly in your congregation, but elsewhere, and just be honest about your own capabilities as an individual, but also as a team, that are missing. Because that actually can be a key blockage, that you just don't have some very practical leadership and management skills to get things moving. But it's not moving into professionalism and brothers, we are not professional. I agree with all that John Piper said on all that. That's fine. But the other side of it is we need to learn strategic leadership, tactical leadership, personal leadership, team leadership. There are leadership management issues that affect all of this. Okay? Hi, we're going to have we have question time now, is that right? I thought it might help just to end on, it's sort of a negative way to end, but we can make it positive. What are some of the, as you're sitting there going through the process today, what are some of the blockages that you feel like are difficult that are going to stop all this happening?
How do you try to accomplish some of the stuff you're talking about if you're not the lead pastor of a church, if you're in a second chair position of leadership?
Yep. Is your pastor here?
Yeah, I'm talking about a church I actually left.
Okay. Yeah.
Don't lead up, lead side.
I thought I'd just double check on that before we,
I recently left the church a couple months ago and joined his church a couple weeks ago.
Yeah. You lead by serving. You know that from the Gospels themselves. So your aim is to facilitate the ministry of your pastor. Your aim is not to establish your kingdom or to change things. Serve hard. Understand your pastor. Serve your pastor. I remember a young man when we were running our apprenticeship coming to me and saying, I'm not getting much out of this, I'm not getting much help. At that point, I really knew that he needed to learn servanthood. So think in terms of what's going on in your pastor's life, in his marriage, his family. What can you do to further his desires and his ministry? As you go along with that kind of spirit, a genuine spirit of service, you will debate things and discuss things. You will bring your ideas, he will bring his ideas. And that, in a context of serving and you serving him, will be very healthy. You may disagree then with some things. If they are biblical truths, then you're in the wrong church. If they are philosophy of ministry things, like what we're talking about today, just understand, we've all been influenced by the heritage we have in the churches we've run. Be curious, find out why your pastor thinks the way he does, why he doesn't like the ideas you've got, rather than feeling like you've got to change him. It's up to the pastor whether he changes or not. It's harder as we get older to change. But basically be on his agenda and choose carefully where you do work so that you know that you substantially are on each other's agenda. It's a serving mentality, I think. Yeah.
Talk about roadblocks. I've shared this in a couple of roundtable discussions already, but one of the roadblocks I've discovered in ministry has been that, in terms of doing this, and is that a lot of the truth that, I'll say it this way, our churches have traditionally used truth to define ourselves up against other Christians. So if we're talking about salvation, we'll talk about salvation as to why we're Reformed and not Arminian. If we talk about baptism, we'll talk about why we immerse as opposed to, and so all of our understanding of truth and doctrine is an in-house conversation. And it's created a cultural trend that truth is about its comparison to other Christians.
Yep.
And now as culture shifts around us, around the church, it's been a struggle for the church to recognize that this truth isn't about comparing ourselves to other Christians, but it's about creating a counter community to the world, showing the world how we live and operate. But that has been a shift that has been a roadblock in many ways, in a variety of subtle ways that I've observed in terms of just shepherding people.
Yeah, I think the answer is always to go back to the scriptures. So if we're still fighting the fights of the 15th, 16th century, and that's our DNA, to stand for that form of church government or that particular confession or the divide over predestination thinking and free will and so on. The key is to keep searching the scriptures and reading and thinking and reading the other side as well, so we really understand. But the mission is to make new disciples, not to preserve our particular part of Reformed or other heritage. And increasingly, as our societies lose the gospel, we have to be on the front foot, engaging with the worldviews outside the church. I don't read a whole lot of blogs, but I get the sense of blogs often that is about, both here and elsewhere, it is about defending our particular theological heritage. There needs to be a lot more on engaging with our society about gender, about what it means to be human, about identity, about true community, about justice, the classic apologetic questions, the Tim Keller kind of work on the idolatry in people's heart. A lot more of that needs to be done. So if you find yourself as a ministry career arguing with your co-pastors in different denominations, that's not really the balance. So I agree with that, yeah. But it may take some retooling to be thinking theologically and apologetically in a culture that's lost Christ, yeah.
You were talking about the different levels of engagement, and I think we've got to really focus back on that earlier level of engagement. That's a starting point, at least I see culturally for my area.
On the left-hand side.
On the left-hand side, of just retraining people how to do that.
Yep. Yeah, it's how to do it structurally, but also personally, how to talk to people about the marriage equality debates and gearing people up for that. And so we did that on that team. We had some nights on the some aspect of the gay marriage redefinition. We had some nights on speaking to Islam, and we had some nights on speaking into Roman Catholicism as part of our training. So they're thinking and gearing up for the kind of conversations they're going to have at the water cooler on Monday morning. We've got to do that across the church, absolutely. Our preaching should help that, should give those frameworks to be able to engage with the worldviews that are coming at us. Yeah.
Colin, you alluded to this in your last slide, but just a common problem that I've seen in a lot of churches is that you do have aging structures that have good intentions, but frankly are just ineffective in accordance to the church's mission at hand. What's some of your advice, I guess, just in being gracious in those situations with those leaders and either reforming or just frankly shutting them down?
Well, just reiterating what I've said, that you're teaching a clear, stable philosophy of ministry to everybody. And then you're modelling it, rather than suddenly shutting things down, you're modelling a new way of being church. And then over time, 3, 4, 5 years, it just makes a bit more sense, even to those who have vested interests, in their particular ministry that they need to change it or stop it or start something else. I'm not an iconoclast. Others would do it differently. Okay, this is my personality. Colin means peace. I'm a peacemaker. Okay, I'm a coward. Okay, so you got to take it. Some might just come in and shut things down. I don't know. We've been invited in by brothers and sisters to be their pastor, one way or the other. I'm not invited in just to suddenly change everything. That's not going to help the next minister either. So it's the careful teaching, publicly, personally, particularly with leaders, but then modelling the change, and hopefully over time, some of the current leaders with ministries that are not as effective, they just start getting it, and they're willing to start something else, step down, or reform their ministry. I've seen quite a bit of that happening. So men's ministry, which in our part of the world can be fishing, bus trips, holidays, whatever, very little word. I've seen some of the churches I'm coaching, they've reformed that men's ministry into a word ministry. They still fish, barbecue, go to the car races, but there's a different heartbeat. So that can happen too, yeah.
Paul, I think one of the blockages to culture change in context I've seen is the success syndrome that's embedded itself in ministry culture in churches, because on two levels. One, that vine work often is not as attractive as trellis work, because trellis work can look successful. It's quantifiable, it's measurable, it's finite. Trellis work is all the way heavenward.
Yep.
And it's a long period. I mean, I'm meeting with some men at my church, and over this past year, I've seen changes in them, but they're slow changes. They're not quick. So that's one blockage sometimes. It's just not as measurable. But the other blockage I think that happens often too, especially in the North American context, is that we don't give each other permission to fail. It doesn't come from the front, the minister. Let's try this out to see if we can move people to the right or engage our culture with the gospel. And hey, if it doesn't work, let's fail together. Let's learn from it and try something new.
Yep.
Failures are the great learning moments in life, but there's a tear to fail in our church, especially if you're the pastor. We're terrified of failure. And you're criticized for it rather than saying, great, that was a good learning moment. Let's learn from it and try something new.
Yep.
Can you speak to that?
No, you've spoken to it. That's exactly right. It's the question with the answer. And it's creative and exciting to try some new things. These teams that we've run are far from perfect. We're still trying to work out how to embed those kinds of ideas in other groups and so on. If my minister was here with me, Phil, we could share with you some of the struggles we've got with it. But just by having a go at it, doing something different with our small groups, it's taught us all kinds of good things. And we've seen some progress with people. Yeah. Okay. Any others? We want to hear from...
If not, I have a question.
Yeah.
Have you encountered reluctance on the part of pastors, elders, churches to think or assess their congregations critically in terms of perspective of moving to the right? And if so, how do you begin to overcome that?
Yeah, I think there is a natural pride and reluctance in terms of clear-eyed honesty as to where our people are at. I don't know. I think in the workshops and the coaching, I've found by the time we get to this point of talking through what a discipling ministry is like, because they're biblical guys like you are, they want it, and then they're willing to look pretty honestly at the 80% who are stuck and start thinking about that and what that means. The cultural Christianity that seems to pervade too many, the unwillingness to change in congregational life. So I think for the senior minister, particularly if you've been in a church for a while, I was very conscious of this on this trip actually, for the senior minister to invite someone like me in to do a consultation, to do some coaching is a very humble thing. They've invested, they've poured their life into it, even for 10 years, whatever it is. To open yourself up to, hey, help me think through from square one again what I'm doing. That's a beautifully humble thing. And I do see a lot of guys doing that, being willing to do that, yeah.
We are going to have a closing interview in a few minutes, but before we do that, we have time for a couple more questions from the floor, from our live stream friends. Any other questions? Comments?
I have a question for moving people to the right from the left, from all of you've talked about today. Could you tell me more about the role and the responsibilities for us as leadership at the church in terms of apologetics? Our ability to use well-reasoned logic to explain what we believe, as well as understanding the current issues around the world. How much should we actually do that on the pulpit? How much should we actually get a good understanding of it? Even to a degree, if you could give a detail, how would you plan your own study and studying the word and also studying the politics in the world?
Yep.
And social issues.
Yeah, we've got to do that. I'm reading Russell Moore. You guys know Russell Moore well. I'm reading his books now, Onward and some other stuff. So you've got to read in your context. There'll be similar writings in Australia, although Russell's writings for America would apply very much to Australia. So you've got to understand what's happening in your culture here. And Russell's very helpful because he says it's not really about culture wars. It is about the gospel. And the aim is different to winning the culture wars, which he doesn't think ever existed. So you've got to think about that culturally in terms of what's happening. I think on the train this morning coming out with Sean, we got talking about framework preaching. So preaching that shows the congregation how to defend the gospel in our culture. So sometimes we think application is all about personal piety, personal application, being more prayerful, dealing with sin, which it is. But there's another kind of application. How does this passage, wherever we're preaching, address the attitudes in society that we have, whether it be about gender or about value or about community or whatever, and showing the implications for how we think and react to and defend some of the culture that's around us, so we can do that in our preaching. And then just the older, there's the presuppositional apologetics where you're challenging the presuppositions of our culture, and then there's the evidential apologetics where we're just giving the evidences for the truth of Christianity. And the older books I studied on that were enormously helpful, and it was helpful in converting people. Was the Josh McDowell kind of books. That goes back a whole generation now, and there'd be equivalent ones floating around. So you've got to think apologetics in those two ways, challenging the presuppositions of our culture, which is the presuppositional apologetics, and the evidentialist apologetics for the truth of the Bible, its inspiration, the historicity of Christ, and so on. Schaeffer's probably the greatest in our recent times in terms of the presuppositional. So I've read a lot of Schaeffer, Oscar Ness, and a lot of people have addressed the evidential side of apologetics. And yes, our preaching has to give some clues on all of that. And then we have to train our people in our teams and groups as to how to do that themselves. Very important, particularly in the less Christianised cultures that we're moving in now. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay.
Colin, thank you very much. I'm convinced I'm not the only one who has found this day fantastically helpful.
Good.
I hope it's spurred many of you on to be thinking this through, to be praying and thinking through how to apply these principles to your ministry, how you move yourself to the right, and also to your various ministry contexts, whether that's in church, in your family life, in your community, or in your ministry organization. Colin, I want to put you on the spot for a moment. A lot of this material is coming from your forthcoming book, Regrowth, which we hope, Lord willing, will be published early next year, by the middle of next year, perhaps.
I'd be happy for it to come out any time, actually.
But I know that many of these ideas come from this wonderful book, The Trellis and the Vine, which you co-authored some years ago with Tony Payne. I was mentioning earlier this morning, the beleaguered pastor. There are so many books to read, so many things we're encouraged to follow. For someone who's here in the room or is listening to us on live stream, why should someone read The Trellis and the Vine?
Well, I think I'll answer it this way. I think it resonated with pastors here and elsewhere because it is about gospel ministry. It's a reminder of that. And then the trellis and vine metaphor gives a way of thinking about how effective our gospel ministry is. Both what trellises are not helping us, but how to build the right trellises to further the ministry of the gospel. So I've really enjoyed coming over here over the last few years because it just resonated with gospel guys, gospel men and women like there are here today and on live streaming. But it gave a helpful analysis of where we're up to, in the trellis and vine metaphor.
Yep,
Yep.
wonderful.
It also moves, the last few chapters do quite a bit of work on the equipping side, of raising up co-workers, raising up apprentices, what teams look like, so some practical stuff in the later chapters. Yeah.
One of the best parts of the book, many great parts of the book I enjoyed, was how you and Tony distilled ministry down to 3 Ps: prayer, people, and proclamation.
Yeah.
A nice, simple distillation.
The means of grace.
Absolutely,
Yep.
absolutely. You can find this resource and the other resource that Carl recommended and that I highly recommend as well, called The Course of Your Life, which is how to implement this with your local church leadership team. You can find those resources and other very good Bible-based quality leadership resources on matthiasmedia.com. Matthias is spelt with 2 T's. If you're in Latin America, North America, Europe, and Africa, you want to go to matthiasmedia.com, where you can order the Trellis and the Vine and The Course of Your Life and other materials. If you're in Southeast Asia, you want to go to matthiasmedia.com.au, to the Australian website, to purchase those materials. And we'll be in touch with you in the spring when Regrowth is published about how to get your hands on that as well. Well, I'd like to invite Todd Kelly up next. Todd is the Global Ministries Director of Leadership Resources International, who I also work with. Come over here, Todd. Carl, you want to stay up here?
Do I?
We're not done with you yet.
Okay.
Today's conference has been co-hosted by Leadership Resource International and Vine Growers, a ministry that Carl works with, and Matthias Media as well. Todd, I'm just wondering if you could begin by just explaining who Leadership Resource International is and what we're all about.
Yeah, thanks for coming, by the way. Great to have you here. Leadership Resources is a ministry that longs to see a movement of the Word of God growing in every part of the world, in every church. And so let me just tell you a story because I think it illustrates the kind of thing that I mean. We were working here in North America, down near St. Louis area, and one of the pastors from that area had our founder come and visit. And he preached on Sunday, and after the sermon was done and they sat down over a meal at the church, he sat down next to a young woman that had a baby, just a few weeks old. And Bill got talking with this woman, and she said, yeah, if it hadn't been for this woman sitting next to me, and he pointed over to the elder's wife, who happened to be next to her, I would have aborted this baby. Mm-hmm. And the woman that was sitting next to her, Bill began his conversation with her, and she said, yeah, my pastor, he came back. He was so excited about the book of Jonah. He had been studying it with you guys, and he learned about the heart of God and the challenge God gives to Jonah in chapter 4. And he said, look for people around you that you can demonstrate this kind of heart of compassion and love to. Surely God has put people in your path that are like that. And so following, they went back to the airport, and Bill, our founder, had a conversation with this pastor, and he just smiled and said, it's all about the Word of God. It's all about the Word of God. And so that kind of a thing is what we long to see, the fruit that comes from the Word of God being proclaimed, being shared, and so forth. And so we work around the world, about 60 different places at this time, and work with national leaders and churches, pastors, and so forth. And this is the type of thing we're longing to see, is a movement of the Word of God.
That's terrific. Tell us, why is Colin Marshall here with Leadership Resources? Why do we want to partner with the Aussies? What on earth are we doing with them?
Well, they kind of grow on you over time. So.
They do.
An acquired taste.
Acquired taste. I think I met you in about 2000.
Yep.
And
At
I was
a
able
student
to go
conference
down,
or something, wasn't it?
Yeah. I was able to go down and spend a little bit of time with Philip Jensen and Chapo, who's now with the Lord. Met a guy there named Phil Wheeler, who gives you endless harassment. And I was sitting there one time, and very much like this, a number of churches gathered. Kyle was getting up front and teaching, and this friend, Phil Wheeler, had paid for me to go to this event. And Kyle said, well, he says, I don't normally like to talk about myself, but I'm going to, and he was announcing what was going on, and Phil Wheeler says, go ahead, you're going to talk about yourself anyway. But that's how you do it in Australia if you like one another. So they're your friends, And I think just through that, we've gotten to know each other over the years, and I think our hearts really resonate. Our ministry is coming at it a bit more from working with pastors and helping to shape their pulpit ministry and their ministry more generally. And I think you're coming at it more from the other end, but we find ourselves resonating very deeply.
Yeah,
I
that's
don't know
right.
if you want to speak to that.
Well, it's also the background of my ministries in relation to Philip Jensen. So I was on the team with Philip. Some of you may or may not know of him, and he was the preacher for 25 years. My work was getting the congregation doing the same work through the week. That was my job, basically, to get the expositional ministry from the pulpit going right down through the groups, through the congregation, with the apprentices, opening the word day by day. So we were talking about a Bible reading movement down into the congregation. And that was my job. Philip's was the public ministry, mine was the private ministries. You guys have been talking about a movement of the Word of God. So it just kind of fits together. A movement to more and more pastors who are preaching and more members who are doing expositional ministry. So
And you talked about the time factor. I can really appreciate that. A number of us that are on staff at Leadership had been greatly influenced through Proclamation Trust, Dick Lucas, David Jackman in London, as well as Philip Jensen, John Chapo, yourself. And it was initially through that ministry of the Word from the pulpit. And as we began to work that out in our churches, as we were preaching week by week, we also realized we didn't just want it to be about the pulpit. We wanted the whole of the church to be permeated with this same type of DNA. And so we began looking a little bit more broadly. That's why the resources from Matthias Media resonated so deeply with us. They were practical tools we could pick up, mission-minded, growth groups, 2 ways to live, all these things, begin to implement them within our churches, and it was complementing the expository pulpit ministry we were also having.
the other group to look to, which we just mentioned, are the English brothers and sisters, the evangelicals around Proclamation Trust, and now many other ministries in England which have had this great preaching ministry, and David Jackman and others have been over here. But they do really well on the personal one-to-one Bible reading and the small groups and the Read, Mark, Learn program. So if you want to get a picture of what a church looks like with strong pulpit exposition and strong member exposition in the pews, take a look at some of the English churches. They really do it well. Yeah.
So maybe 3-4 years ago, maybe a little longer than that, we began chatting, saying, is there some way we should come together and partner, whether that's formal or informal? And I remember sitting with Tony Payne in Sydney, and we were chatting back and forth, and he's doodling on his napkin, and I think he took that shredded napkin back to you, and you actually produced a chart, one you showed earlier about
Somehow it happened,
the expository ministry.
Yeah, I fixed his doodles that weren't quite right.
I thought it worked the other way, but sorry, Tony.
Yeah. And what we thought really was that, God is an expository God. He is a speaking God. He talks to us. He reveals himself. And it's from that basis that everything else should flow. And I'm not real familiar with other ministries. Probably it's my own ignorance. But other ministries that see the cohesiveness of pulpit and pew so that the Word of God is going out from the pulpit, it's going to the people, it's going out from the people. So that's a real burden for us to see those things come together. And I think that's where your conference work has also shared that conviction.
That's right, yeah. So the partnership is really very effective for us, yeah.
And we're starting to see that partnership happen here in the U.S. Through our partnership with Vine Growers and Matthias Media. In our workshops here in the U.S., where we're training pastors in a movement of the Word, training them to be stronger expositors through our 4-year workshop. That's something we do internationally as well. But right now, we're really seeking to test drive this partnership in the U.S. And as it grows and develops, we want to do this overseas. We're in about 23 different countries overseas. And of course, Trellis and Vine has been translated into about 6 languages, I think, so far. So this is a partnership that we want to see, Lord willing, bear fruit around the world. But here in the U.S., there's a pastor I was having lunch with yesterday who's been coming to our preaching workshops here in the U.S. And in our last workshop 6 months ago, we talked about how we're strengthening you to preach the word and start a movement of the word and multiply your ministry. And I said, I want to encourage you guys to go home and think about how do you multiply this amongst your members and get an expository ministry working through your church. Well, this brother has started a regrowth group. He didn't call it a regrowth group, but he will now. And he started, I want to hear from him. Pastor David Smith, would you come up for a moment? Can you give the mic? Pastor David, you are the pastor of Crete Church, just south of Chicago. Some years ago, you got involved with our ministry in Ethiopia. I know you've traveled with us to Ethiopia on workshops. And now you're part of a workshop here in West Chicago in DuPage. And 6 months ago, you came to our workshop on Jonah. You and I were having lunch yesterday, and you told us something you're doing in your church with your leaders. And I just wondered if you could explain a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I went to Ethiopia this past November and just saw all the training that Leadership Resources does. Got back and I was talking with Joe and just said, man, I'd love to be a part of that myself and experience some of that here. And so he invited me into the Fellowship of the Word in DuPage and just had such a great 2.5 days there, being in the Word, studying the Word, being with a group of guys talking about it, and recognized the power of that for my own soul, but also saw that in the discipleship aspect of our current congregation that we needed to raise up leaders that were in the Word, passionate about the Word, being refreshed by the Word also. And so a month ago, we began our first Fellowship of the Word group within our church. We have 8, 9 members of our church, leaders, teachers. We invited about 20 to check it out. We had 9 of them commit to it. And so we just started to dive into the book of Jonah about 2 weeks ago. Our next meeting's in 2 weeks. And just a group of people real passionate about wanting to get into the Word and discover it themselves, and praying and hoping that through that we see them have that same attitude to want to bring that then also to other members in the congregation.
Yeah, I just want to quickly ask you about that. What is your and their shared vision for this group? What sort of fruit do you hope to see to come out of that group?
What fruit on a couple levels. One is for them personally, just to be able to open up a scripture passage and be able to walk through that passage and have some basic hermeneutical principles that enables them to discover the truth within that passage without, we had to kind of chastise them a little bit at the first time because we're sitting there having a conversation. All of a sudden, a couple of them are quoting stuff from MacArthur's commentary from off of their phones and stuff. We're like, no. We want this. We want you to discover what you can find within the scriptures and not have to always turn to commentaries. And so that's the first one. And then the second one is that they have that same passion, that same desire to turn around, and whether it be in their small groups or whether it be in discipleship classes or regrowth groups or whatever you want to call it, that they would have that same attitude and that same heart to bring that to other members of the congregation.
That's fantastic. Cole, I think he should run the next regrowth
Yeah,
part
right.
2.
Employ Brandon and David. And,
Ladies and gentlemen, meet Exhibit A. Well, just one final thing before we go. Thank you very much, David. Cole, you've mentioned a few names: Peter Jensen, Phil Wheeler, Tony Payne. You've been part of a team ministry that's been doing this for 40 plus years. You're not a solo artist, and I know you don't feel you are. You've been part of a wonderful team. But perhaps the most important and influential partner is your lovely wife, Jackie Marshall.
Yes.
Jackie, would you come up here, please? She's very shy, but we're gonna make her come up. She can slap my hand later. It's been our privilege and joy to have both Cole and Jackie with us here in the States this past 2 weeks. We've done some training with LRI staff. We were in Atlanta earlier this week, in the Deep South in Carrollton, Georgia, where they like to call you Miss Jackie.
Miss Jackie.
And now we're here, and we know you're heading to New York on Monday.
Yes, sir.
But I just want to publicly say that we just love you guys and are so grateful for your ministry, as many, many are around the world.
Thank you.
And it's been a delight and pleasure and privilege to have you both here with us these 2 weeks. And I know how well together you work as a couple. You really are ministry partners. And Jackie, we're very grateful for your ministry to women and how you've so beautifully partnered with Cole over the years as well. It's a real encouragement to all of us. So we're very grateful that you're here. And super glad for your time. Thank you very much. Well, we are out of time today. So for those of you in Brazil and Belfast and Dublin and Alaska, North Dakota, Carrollton, Georgia, and Sydney, Australia, thanks for joining us as well. And once again, if you have any more information you're looking for, you can speak to us here live afterwards. But of course, you can visit matthiasmedia.com to look at those resources. You can also look at leadershipresources.org, which is our website, if you want to find out more about our ministry. And we'd be delighted to come alongside you and serve you. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for coming to Regrowth Chicago 2015. We'll see you next time.
Shake your hands.